Hi patrons, welcome back to the final part in this tutorial series. In the first part we were working on the background, in the second part we were working on the robin, and in this final part we're just going to be working on adding in the highlights. So to do this I am using white gouache and I'm using the one by Winsor & Newton in the colour Permanent White, and I'm just using this to get in some of those brighter highlights and to lighten up any areas that I want to. I also am going to use it to add any splatters that I want to as well. So with gouache, you can have it looking really opaque if you don't add much water at all, and if you add a lot more water then it's going to look more transparent and you'll see some of the watercolour colours showing through. So for the moment I just added a little bit on the highlighted part of the beak, and anywhere where I want it to be a really intense bright highlight I will use a thicker consistency of that paint, add less water. So for example I'm now focusing on all of the little details like underneath the eyes and the highlights on the eyes. And I'm looking at the reference and I'm pulling out the highlights and I'll accentuate them even more because I do want this piece to have a lot of contrast to it, and I do want to have a decent amount of highlights in there. I'm also going to use the gouache to create more of a feathery texture to the bird. And we're going to be using it to add lots of highlights for the background, for example on the flower. If your consistency of your gouache is too thick, then you'll find that it's hard to actually blend and mix onto the paper. You'll find that you'll see too much of the paper showing through and it won't really flow nicely. So if you're finding that your gouache is not flowing nicely, then I would recommend adding a tiny bit more water and it should flow a bit better. If it feels too dry, then it's probably because it doesn't have enough water. Now, the gouache will apply quite bright to the paper. Even if you add quite a bit of water to it, when you apply it to the paper, it will look very, very white and very bright. But note that when it does dry, when your painting does dry, the actual watercolour gets darker. So it does dry darker. It looks very opaque when you apply it down, even though you've added a lot of water. But the colours will start to show through of your watercolour underneath as it starts to dry, as the gouache starts to dry. So don't worry if you've mixed in quite a bit of water and it starts to dry and you think it's going to be too bright. It will darken up quite a bit and become a lot more transparent and translucent. I'm just adding some highlights now for the feet, and I'm looking at every part of the painting and identifying the brightest parts of that area. Overall, I'm really happy with how it's looking for the moment. I just want to add a few little details, even on the wing, even on dark areas. I do want to add a few little highlights. And a lot of the highlights that I'm adding, when they dry, they will become very, very subtle. You also don't just have to use the gouache to actually add in details, you can use it just to lighten up a whole area in general. Gouache is really good at covering the watercolour. So for example, if you make a mistake and you want to white it out and just cover it up with white paint, then this works really well at covering up any mistakes you make. If for example you wanted to preserve an area and keep it white, but you accidentally went over it a little bit, then you can just go back in with the white and cover that up completely. Of course, it's best if you do want to preserve highlights to try and preserve them as much as possible, but sometimes we can't help it. Sometimes a little bit of paint does bleed into an area that we wanted to preserve, or we accidentally, put a bit of watercolour where we shouldn't have and we didn't realise. So it's always good to have this option to fall back on. You can see that I'm really overlapping quite a bit of the gouache for those areas of the chest of the bird that were highlighted. And I'm doing this using brush strokes that are going with the direction of the fur to give the robin more of a fluffy texture. I am starting off by using a very small round brush. I like to use this for all of the little details, and you don't need too much of this gouache on your brush at all. a little bit of the gouache really does go quite a long way. So for example, you can see I'm cleaning up the edge of the bird there. So now I'm just going to continue to go throughout the bird and finish adding any of these little highlights that I want to make and any little bits of feather texture. Now I just want to add a bit more highlight just underneath the bird once again, but I'm not going to leave it as harsh as this. I will be blending it out a little bit. So I'm just cleaning my brush, and like I did with the watercolours in previous parts, I'm just teasing at the edge of the gouache just to blend it out. And then I'm adding a little bit more gouache right by the bird just to make it a bit brighter. So I'm also creating a few little splatters using my brush just by loading it with gouache and then tapping onto the back of the brush like we've been doing in all of the previous parts. So now I'm going to go back to the bird and finish off adding some of these final highlights. I am using very thick gouache right now just to get in some of the brightest highlights. For example, for the beak and right at the top of the head. So once again, I'm just going to spend a few minutes doing that. Look at your bird, identify any areas that you want to brighten up a bit. Is there any areas of your painting that you feel is a little bit dark? Or is there any areas where you feel like you want to add a bit more texture? Just go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to add quite a bit of gouache right underneath the chest area. So it is quite highlighted in this section, and I did want to add a bit more contrast, so I really did want to make it look nice and bright. You can see I'm using little feathery brush strokes in order to actually integrate the body with the chest feathers, so that they integrate a bit more nicely and subtly into each other. You can see I'm using lots of little lines, definitely following the direction that the feathers are going in and how they're falling on the body of the bird. And if you want to soften or bleed anything out, remember, get a clean brush and simply just blend that out. If you feel like you put down too much gouache, then you can lift it up with a tissue if it's still wet. And once again, just going to add a few final highlights, for example, on the wings and straight back to the sort of neck of the bird, just by the beak. And as things dry, because it is hard to predict, because they do dry a little bit darker, sometimes you might think that you've got it sort of a thick enough consistency. You'll think that the gouache is opaque enough, and you'll apply it down, wait for it to dry, and actually it needs to be a lot thicker. You have noticed that the highlights are actually too subtle and you need to brighten it up more. So then you can mix up a thicker consistency of the gouache with less water and get in even more of those brighter highlights. I'm now just going to top the branches with a little bit of highlight as well, because if you do look at the reference, you'll see that with the branches, the shadow is pretty much on the bottom part, the underneath part of the branch, and the top is a little more highlighted. So I really do want to add those highlights, so I am adding quite a bit of highlight just on the top of the branches. And it will also help to actually sort of put the branch apart from the background to separate them a bit more, and to bring the branch forward and make it more of a focal point, so it doesn't just merge in with the background so much. And to do this, I am using quite thick gouache. I'm not using too much water in this case. I'm also adding some brighter highlights to the feet. And a few more splatters. I like to do this all the way around the painting because I feel like it gives it a really nice sparkly look, and I really like that with my paintings, them looking a little bit sparkly. I'm also adding a few little wisps with my white paint just to make it a little more interesting. I feel like it just makes it look really nice and pretty. Just doing some of these coming down from the top. Just adding even more gouache on top of the branch. Because like I said, we've noticed that it's gone a bit too dark. It's not really that bright, so I'm using a more opaque consistency of gouache. And I really do want to start to add the highlights to our main flower. So just underneath that shadowed petal, there's a bit of highlight, and I just want to look around the flower and just identify every area that needs to be brightened up a little bit. And you can see that I just applied the gouache and then used the clean brush to bleed it out into the rest of the background. So I do want to add quite a bit of gouache and really lighten up the back part of the petal here on the right hand side. So I'm first outlining the shape of that petal, and then I'll spread and bring some more of that gouache down further towards the centre of the flower. I'm starting with more dilute consistency of the gouache with more water, and then I will be applying and dotting in some more thick and more opaque gouache as well. But I do like to start it off quite light and thin and then use thicker paint. Also creating a few little splatters around the flower as well. Just adding more highlight to the branches. And I'm just leaving that gouache on the petal to settle, just so I can judge how much brighter I need to make it. I was thinking about adding a highlight in the bottom right hand corner, but after I did this, I didn't really feel like I liked it too much. So I decided to pat it away with some tissue. As you can see, I'm not just like moving on to each area and then leaving areas. I will keep revisiting parts that I've already highlighted to just have a little look and check to see if I need to brighten it up even more. For example, I want to brighten up under the eye even more. And on the top of the head. I'm just adding a few little brighter brush strokes for the feathers. So I've added a few more splatters, and now I'm just adding a slightly thicker wisp. And now I'm going to go back in, and I just want to brighten up this petal a bit more. Now that it's dry, I can see that I really do need to brighten it up more. So I'm going in with much thicker gouache, just outlining the top of the petal to start off with. Just placing the gouache, the thickest gouache in the brightest areas, and then I'll get some water on my brush and just bleed this out. So I'm just dragging that paint further into that petal, further towards the centre. And I'm just getting some thicker paint and dotting this into the brightest areas as well. And because the surface is already wet, it's going to nicely bleed out and give a much smoother look with no harsh edges. I'm also highlighting slightly under the flower just to make the flower stand out even more by having more of a contrast, because the bottom of that petal is a very dark pink. To make that flower and that petal really stand out, I'm just adding a bit of highlight underneath it. Yet again, adding a few more sort of wispy bits with the white gouache. Now I'm just topping the branch. Right over on the left hand side, I'm just topping it with a little bit of gouache. It's looking very bright at the moment, and I don't really want it to be that bright, just adding a few more splatters. I don't want it just to be one thick stroke, so I'm just taking my brush and I'm just smoothing it over that area to lift up some of that paint so it's not so bright. And I'm going to mix a bit of purple in there and just dab it in a few places with my tissue, just actually to lift up some of the gouache so it's not just one line, so that there's more of a highlight in certain places and then you can see more of the purple flowers behind other parts of the branch. I don't want everything to be uniformed. I do want it to be like slightly jagged and patchy. For example, with the branch, I don't want there just to be one clean line for the highlight on top of the branch. I want it to be a bit more patchy. Just going through, adding a few more splatters. I will be adding some bigger splatters in a second. Now I'm just going through that petal and once again adding some even brighter gouache. Because remember how bright that looked when it was wet? Now you can see how much it's darkened up now that it started to dry. And once again just outlined that harsh edge that we want to create with really thick gouache. And then I'm just rinsing off my brush so that I can tease that really thick gouache into the centre of the petal. So I applied the thickest gouache where I wanted it to be the brightest and where I wanted there to be a harsh line. And then I use a clean, just wet brush with just water on it to tease the edge of where that gouache is in order to actually blend it into the rest of the petal really seamlessly. Just adding a little bit more gouache in a few key areas. And now that it's got some highlight there, I feel like this flower looks a lot better than it did before. But that's down to preference as well. You might have thought it looked better before without the highlight. If I'm honest, I think I really like it how it is at the moment. I really like how it's looking. So I'm just going to finish off adding some more gouache to the petals just to finish off this flower. Now I'm going in and I want to create a flower using the white gouache, so I just added in a little wisp and I'm just adding a little bit of a flower to it. I kind of wish I didn't do this. I'm recording this voiceover after I did this painting, by the way. So I kind of wish I didn't do this. I might actually go and erase it. So you can erase gouache. Like I can go in, add a bit of water to the gouache and literally just lift it up, and I'll probably do that because I don't really like how this turned out. So if you don't want to include this bit, then that's fine. I think I preferred how it looked before I did all this. But if you like it, you might prefer it this way. So if you do, I thought I'd include it so you could follow along if you like these bits. But personally, I preferred it, you know, without these white flowers. But if you do want to do them, I am just doing this in the exact same way that I did as when I used the pinks and purples. Just stippling it and making it thicker at the base and then thinner right at the top of the flower. So now I just want to take a little bit of gouache using a bigger brush, and I'm going to make some splatters. And when you use a bigger brush, it means that you're going to get bigger droplets. So if you want bigger splatters, then switch over to using a bigger brush. So before I was using a really tiny round brush and that got me really tiny splatters. But now that I'm using a slightly bigger round brush, it allows me to get in a variety of splatter sizes. But I did want to make just a couple of even bigger ones, a few really big ones. So once again, I just added highlight to that branch and tapped over it with some tissue just to tone it down a bit. And I'm just going to continue to add a few more splatters. In this final stage, I'm not only going to add some splatters with the white, I'm also going to go back and start adding even more splatters with our different colours. So now I'm switching over to my biggest brush, and I'm using this because I just want to make a few really big splatters. So I'm loading up my brush with even more paint, and you can see that it just drops on and creates a really nice splatter. To do this, it helps if you have a bit more water on your brush. So I got some more water, mixed it in with the gouache so that the drop just falls off the brush and creates that really nice splattered edge to it. So I just created a couple of them, and I really just want a variety of splatters, so that's why I want some big ones as well. And now that's all I want to do with that bigger brush. So now I'm going to go in, and you can see I'm using lots of other colours. I'm starting off with pink, and I'm just going to go in and splatter lots of different colours all around the piece. Once again, just to give it more texture. I love the splatter effect. It's one of my favourites to use. And I pretty much do this in all of my loose, expressive watercolour paintings. I'm also going to be doing this with orange and like purples, blues, yellows, all of the colours that we've been using throughout this piece. So just go ahead and tap with your paintbrush. So anyway guys, that is it for this painting. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. Right now I just wanted to take off the tape, and as you can see, this is the final result. I really hope that you guys did enjoy following along with this tutorial and you enjoyed learning these techniques, and if you did create this piece yourself, then make sure to post it on the community tab. I'd love to see what you guys created. But I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Bye everybody.